the Grey Hat Beard podcast. Hello and welcome to part 2 of show 30 of Grey Hat Beard, the modern workplace podcast, where we talk about all things Microsoft 365. Last week we shared the latest news and talked about some of the great Teams developments coming up and Microsoft buying Twitter. But now we're going to go into our buying Twitter. Yeah, didn't you know? A week's time, they haven't announced it yet. Sorry, I meant to say buying Discord on there.
You heard
so
it here
breaking
first,
news
folks.
for anyone listening. Yeah, exactly. And that was an intentional error, because now we're going to be talking about testing and what happens. How do you make for mistakes? Look at that.
Seamless.
Over that nicely.
Beautifully done, Kev. Beautifully done.
So, yeah, baby. What the reason we're talking about this, I think, is Al and I have been working on a project, and Al very kindly has been thrown into the deep end to help me out, where we had a big migration, and the reality of how much you test, and when you've got huge volumes on there, the amount of time to test can be massive. And you kind of think you're buying migration tools and you have your processes and they should just work and everything should turn out at the end nicely. And maybe there's a bit of validation and having a quick check and asking the users to have a look and that sort of thing. Unfortunately, when things start to go a little bit wrong, they often go very wrong. And it's that point someone goes, why don't we have tests for all these different things? And everyone starts looking at each other. And really, you probably should have planned a lot of these things and agreed what was going to be done ahead. So I'm going to cover 3 rough areas. One, we're going to talk about why you should test everything, why you shouldn't just go ahead and do it and then improve it when you find it and then fix issues as they come up. But why you should have some product testing, what sort of tests you can do. And obviously, when you think of testing, many people think about development projects, but we're thinking why that. So when you're doing migrations, if you're rolling out Teams, if you're turning on voice within Teams, how do you make sure things have worked? It's not just about the development side of things here. And finally, how do you record and capture that test and actually make use of it? How do you make sure it's useful for there? So, Al, why should you bother testing things?
Oh, I think that's pretty simple, isn't it? You want to make sure that you have a happy customer at the end of the day, and you want to make sure that your users actually use your system. The worst possible thing that you can do when you make any change is for your users on day one to find that things don't work. It immediately creates a blocker to them adopting and using the solution that you're putting in place. So to avoid that, test it. Make sure it actually does what the users expect it to do, what they've been trained to do, maybe, but also to make sure that actually it functions. It does what you intend it to do, and it does it well, it does it effectively, it performs well, performs at scale, the scale that you need it to perform at, so that essentially you have happy users on day one and they can actually start using your solution, your application, whatever it is that you're putting out. Could be a car, could be software, could be a kite that you're trying to fly. Test it, make sure that actually it works so that you don't have a disappointed customer. And
why shouldn't you test something?
Well, that inevitably comes down to those corners that get cut, the cost. People underestimate how much time it takes to test something properly, and they underestimate the detail to which you need to go to test it effectively, to ensure that it is actually doing what you need it to do. And I think that's something that we've all been there, where you kind of go, it'll only take 30% of the time to develop. 30% of the project is going to be testing. That always used to be how you kind of 30% to design, 30% to build, 30% to test. That was a sort of the waterfall sort of finger in the air. But people used to go, well, wait a second, it's going to take you the same amount of time to test it as it takes to build it. That can't be right. And I think that's the mentality. People expect things to be perfect, but they don't expect the effort that is actually required to make sure that things are perfect.
Yeah.
And the more complex they are, the more they need to be tested.
I think the one way to look at it is, I think of testing as confidence more than anything else. That's what you're buying with that time. You're buying the confidence that what you set out to achieve has been verified and you have a record of, this piece of code will behave in this particular way under these conditions. And you can go to the level of testing absolutely everything and having huge test scripts and all that kind of stuff, and that's fine. But you might want to say, well, we'll make sure that the core of it works, and then if we do have any issues, we'll pick those up as we go along. From my point of view, having a set of tests from a development point of view, it's confidence that it works, but also gives confidence for us to release faster as well. So because we know that we've got that confidence in our tests that things are going to work, we can just keep shipping, and we can have that confidence that 90% of what we're putting out, or 99%, whatever number you're going to go for, is going to work. And you always get those little edge cases. There's always things that are slightly off, that you might want to, that things crop up. But then again, if that happens, you're wanting confidence that that's not going to happen again. So add a test in there, add a test script, add a unit test in, add that in, so that case is covered. Because again, you're working with business people, right? They're using this as a tool for their day-to-day job, and they're reliant on this tool as well. They want to have confidence that if a new feature comes out, you've not broken everything else.
So you mean you have to test new features that come out, even when it's software as a service and you're not in control of those features coming out?
And that was one of the things I was going to say, that with a lot of people say is, why don't you need to test if you're using a service such as SharePoint? Microsoft tests it. They make sure it works as expected. So as long as you're using the base functionality, it just works. Is another argument that can sometimes be thrown at. But I think the reality of that is it may work with this. You probably don't want to test every bit of functionality of SharePoint, of Teams, of whatever you're rolling out, because Microsoft should be doing that. But there's a lot of configurations, especially around permissions and what you can turn on. Should you have search enabled on things? Should it be turned off? There's a lot of configuration points, both that you can set from the UI, you can set from the back end, from PowerShell. So knowing where they have been set, whether they could change, example, yeah, absolutely.
I think this is the thing, that what you're testing can vary dramatically. If you're testing whether a kite is going to fly, that's quite easy to replicate when you've got wind and you can test it, and it's you're going to know
dependencies, right? That's
absolutely
yeah.
Where you've got an environment that is a production environment that has terabytes of data, and it's not something that you can just back up and restore into a development or a test environment, it's very, very difficult to actually replicate. And you said it earlier, Gary, replicate those conditions so that you can test it and make sure that it's going to work. And that's probably the biggest challenge that in the software as a service space we see, is that actually creating those conditions in order to test them is actually exceedingly difficult.
Yeah.
And you said, why do people not test? When we go to a client and say you need 3 different tenants, not 3 different sites, but 3 different tenants with representative licensing and processes
ideally the same
place.
Volumes of data. Yeah.
It's not like it was when we were all, happily sat there with our servers and we could just spin up some VMs in our own data center, back up and move some databases and have a replica of our production environment.
Ever remember being happy doing that? But I know what you
mean. Come on, we all know that was just to press a button and it just happened. Yeah. But the point is that we can't always test ahead of time what's actually going to happen, and that's probably one of our biggest challenges, is that we can't do that. We have to be representative. We have to be testing samples, not testing everything. So we've got to be very clever about what we choose to test and how we choose to test it, how we choose to replicate performance and scalability.
So how do you test? Maybe we start here with Gary. Yeah. Yeah, I tried that. Thanks, Al.
Yeah.
Maybe because maybe it's from where I've come from, but a lot of the testing stuff has come out from the development world, where you're doing very bespoke things you want to test. So maybe Gary, kick off with, you talked about things like unit tests, you've got integration tests, and then we can sort of throw what that means to less developer-y situations.
Yeah, I think it's developers got there first because we're all lazy, right? We don't want to repeat the same things over and over again. So we write code to do it for us. So, we can write our unit test code, which would say, I want to make sure that this piece of code, it might be a function, might be, like an add function, that if I give it 2 and 2, I get 4 out under all those conditions, and I can test that. And I can write something that will just repeat that test every time I change the code base, right? And that's a really easy way of kind of being able to just verify that, yeah, the add function still works, even though I've changed other things. Or I don't know, you want to change that add function for whatever reason and change its behavior, you've got a record of what it actually does. I think that's kind of, from the dev side, it's kind of that laziness, because the alternative is every time you release something, someone's going to have to go for a script and go through a series of steps and verify visually that is the desired outcome. And as an application grows, that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So every time you release, you've got 100 test scripts that someone's got to go through, every single one potentially, to verify that yes, that works, and that takes time. But there's this mix of manual testing, automated testing, that really should happen all the time. It shouldn't be one or the other. You should always have those manual elements, because there's things that you might not want to be able to you might not think actually we want to go to that level of detail. We'll do a manual test for that. Things that we can't really test easily. It might be a dependency that we've got, like the wind with the kite.
And it's an integration with other systems.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
there's all sorts of different scenarios where you have dependencies that you can't easily replicate, or as you say, I have one client I was working with, and they said, well, how do we test our integration? They were pulling everything into a database from multiple systems. Okay, well, do you have test versions of all of those systems that you're pulling into that database? Well, no, we don't. Well, in that case, we need to be a bit more selective about what we're testing, because you can't replicate everything.
Yeah, I mean, a great one I've seen is connecting up to payment systems. How do you test a payment to a bank? And you can mock up elements to that, but there's so many parts of that can change, and you don't want to be throwing money all over the place and make a mistake, because you're going to get in a lot of trouble if you get your zeros in the wrong place and your decimal points going around. So there's a lot you need to do and think about elements like that.
But you can test what's expected as a response for good scenarios and bad scenarios. So CLI for Microsoft 365, we have hundreds and hundreds of unit tests, thousands of unit tests, and we're testing primarily against dependencies that we can't replicate. SharePoint Online, Microsoft Graph. We have to come up with solutions to be able to say, when we call this particular endpoint, it will respond in this particular manner, and then our code can then continue. We don't actually have to make a call into a tenant to do that. However, that comes with disadvantages of, this is what we're expecting. And like we were saying before, of course, Microsoft is testing their stuff. That's great. But then things can go wrong on their side, right? And we can get a response that we're not quite expecting, that our test doesn't quite cover, which may raise a bug. But then we've got that coverage to say, OK, this has changed in a way that we didn't expect. We can either go back to Microsoft and say, did you break something? Is this the new way that you're doing it? And then we can adapt accordingly. We can put a bug fix in, or actually help Microsoft find an issue that they need to resolve.
There's things like, I'm sure it was Valo that kind of told Microsoft about things that had changed on their site and stuff like that. It's like, this is working. Now it's not. We'd show you, within a few minutes of that test failing, exactly what's happened and what's changed and what it's now reacting. And that's that sort of level of test.
Which from a support perspective, right, having some tests is really valuable, because it gives you that area to look at, and you can go, okay, we expected this, but we're getting something different. Why is that? And you're not kind of working so much in the dark. It's a bit easier to pinpoint where the issues are as well.
So Al, if we've got all these automated tests that are fantastic, and you can do them with Power Platform, there's testing and things available in that, and you can automate ones there. That means you don't need any user testing, do you either? They're just happy. It just works.
Yeah, if only that were the case, eh? I think the thing about automated testing is you need to have very clear tests to carry out. You need to be able to define them and you need to mock them. Users
just very quickly for anyone listening, when we talk about mocking testing, it's where you put in kind of known quantities. So things like if you're calling SharePoint, when you want to retrieve a list of sites, you would get a certain amount of data. Mocking it is putting in place test versions of that without having to call data. It's not about laughing at test.
Although we do like to do that as well.
We do that too.
But I think that, the users inevitably, I'm a terrible user to test things. You'd never want me to test your solution because the first thing I do is break it. And
it's the best test, though. That's brilliant. That's what you want.
Oh. But
depends how late you are.
The reason I do that is because inevitably most people do the happy testing. We've talked about lots of types of testing, and I think it's important to work out at what point we release some of this into the wild, because unit testing tends to be the developer going, yeah, I think I've done what I'm supposed to have done. I think I've delivered on the spec that I've been given. It does what it's supposed to do. Excellent. So you've given me a form and I can put in a number into it and I can put another number and it will multiply them together and give me the output. First thing I'm going to do is put an @ symbol in there. Why? Well, because the test probably didn't cover what the validation is. And I think that's where users really come in. They will always do things that you do not expect. And they will always look at things and interpret it in a way that the designers have not thought about, because they're very focused on, this is the happy side of it. It's going to do these wonderful things. Users inevitably go, well, I don't understand why I have to do it that way. Why can't I do it this way? Turn it upside down, then enter the numbers and then see what happens.
I think also the user testing is testing the requirements are correct. When you're going to speak to users, you detail, listen to what they want, capture those requirements, pass a document which they can have a quick look over, hopefully read, but maybe have interpreted it in their own way when it comes through to come to a system, what they thought they wanted versus what has actually come out.
That assumes somebody's read it through and gone,
yes, I was trying to be nice.
Just going, just build it. Yeah.
But the reality of what they actually want versus maybe what they thought they want can change, and there can be differences when you actually see things down on paper and see them actually working.
Absolutely. And I think this is the
so
thing.
I think this testing the requirements effectively as well.
There's also, whilst we're working with users to try and visualize what the end game is going to be, what that solution is going to be, we understand the technology and the interfaces. We're visualizing it. They are thinking of something completely different. We're talking about Yammer and they're thinking Facebook. It's very different. So their expectations are going to be very different. And so it's trying to actually make sure that we're meeting those expectations. The user experience obviously is crucial for all of this for users.
And that's what testing really comes back to, right? Those initial expectations, like you mentioned, spec. You've got to be able to have a spec to write a test against and to validate it. If you don't have that nailed down, it's what are you testing?
I mean, your tests could be in your spec in some cases. They could be very closely aligned, but generally.
Yeah, I mean, tests, we talk about all sorts of different tests. We talk about mocking things up, but there's testing the UX. How can you put it in front of a user and they just work it? Do they understand it? Do they know what's going on? I had it today. If you're testing things and you're putting test data that the end user doesn't recognize, they're going to think it's broken or isn't working as expected because it's not familiar. And that's not functional. That's contextual information that's in there. So there's lots and lots of layers that you need to get right for a user just to pick something up and go, I know exactly what I'm doing and I can work with this.
It's like we talked about unit tests, which might be clicking a button and the button's going to do a particular, like an output, right, of like two fields and a button. But actually systems are more complex than that, right?
Yeah.
So you need to actually take all these individual elements that may work under their own certain scenarios and then put them all together in an end-to-end test where you're, like a user going through a form of the whole validation, that end-to-end kind of test is vital. Then that you're not just covering the little bits of functionality, it's how everything hangs together.
It's interesting you said validation in there, because I think of validation as being something slightly different to testing. Testing is much more subjective. Validation is a yes, no. We validated that it's correct.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
And, so Kev, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, wait a second, what's he talking about? We've been testing and validating this stuff.
Yeah. Sorry, is testing not yes or no? Then I suppose user testing isn't, but
it's more subjective. It can be yes, no, maybe, kind of, what about this, what about that, open up a lot more responses. Whereas validation might be, I've carried out this process and I want to validate that the output is what I'm expecting.
Which I think leads on a little bit to what I was going to talk about outside of developing world, development world. We're talking Microsoft 365. Many people listening will be rolling out things on Microsoft 365, whether that's Teams Voice, whether it's rolling out new SharePoint intranet, whether it's migrating millions of files up to between SharePoint and Teams and things. And there's tests you need to do there. I mean, maybe if we talk about an intranet, what would you test? Because certainly if you're going out the box with SharePoint, what would be the kind of things you'd be looking at to test with that?
So I would take a smoke test approach, which is basically comes from the sort of the electronics and hardware. If I put current through it, does it smoke? Shows me where things shows me where things are broken. And I think that's, if you've got approvals, if you've got processes that are kicking in that are unseen by the end user, you can teach a user to upload a document or to download a document. Is everything else working in the background? And that's where you've got those sort of single processes that you can push something through and you can go, yep, I've put my 10 documents through that process and, I've accelerated it. Maybe, gone through the process with known users, known people to interact and work through it. Yes, it's all working. Right now, let's set it to the production people. I remember designing a process that had what seemed to be quite a simple process. And, we had a beautiful Visio diagram that ended up being about 3 sheets of A1. It had over 1,000 tests to actually go through every single path through it. And for me, that's the sort of testing that you should be doing for any process, to say all the routes that you can go through are the routes that you should be testing. Good, bad, unthought of. That way, at least you have evidence as well. I've got these 30 different scenarios they've run through. These are the users that have been involved, and I can see that everything's working as expected.
And I think the other one is to look up to roll up. So let's assume you are maybe budget limited, or maybe you're using a service which should do what it says. I'm not going to sound bad and get in trouble here, but I'm not going to mention any tool's name, but Microsoft Fast Track, for example, will take your on-premise data with its file shares, various older versions of SharePoint, and they given a set of mapping files. They'll say, right, this content was there. We want it to go up to there in SharePoint Online. Now, if you test every single document there for something when effectively that service should do it for you, you could argue that's overkill for there. But you may want to do some high level, whether it's smoke test or validation. So, for example, you could know that I don't necessarily this file is going to go into this folder or this file is going to go into that folder, but I know I'm moving 5,000 files. There's 5,000 files at source. Therefore, somewhere in the sites, even if it's a different site, I should be able to say how many files are in this site, how many files in this one, add those up, that should equal 5,000. So you can do those kind of high level roll ups. And it could be the same for when you're looking at intranets. If you've got an live on an intranet and you're seeing 50 pages being added per day, then you should be able to guess that there should be 50 approvals, for example. And if your numbers aren't matching up, you've got a kind of secondary validation that will really point you towards where a problem is. It wouldn't tell you exactly where things are, but it will give you a kind of quick and easy way to give you that now, Al, we've found from the migration recently, one of the big problems we've got is if we move things up to SharePoint Online, if you've got a lot of different sites and you've got a lot of different libraries to go and query that, it is hard and takes a lot of time on there. Not to say don't do it, but if you're constantly changing things, and for example, you've got that Delta migration just before you go live, you want to check the numbers. Being able to do those rolled up numbers that say, is everything generally looking good, or is everything generally looking like a problem, which can help you drill down to where the more specific areas are help as well. So think about how you can kind of roll up and aggregate some numbers and get some high level, I don't know if that's smoke test, but it's that high level validation of things that allow you to then dig into the deeper details of things as well.
I mean, it is the high level validation, isn't it? It's to say you're going to move, 10 million files. You really want to make sure that you've got, your 10 million files in the target environment, and whether that means that you are doing a spot check, are they all correct, or you're choosing an area and doing a more detailed validation to validate those particular areas. But we want to be able to say to the users, yes, look, here's evidence, here's details of what we've moved, and we can see that those files are there. Can you go now check them and make sure that you think that they are okay? And then I was going to say farming out the validation, but you're delegating it to the people who know the content. And for an intranet,
and it's
for an
again
organization,
picking up on issues. It's picking up on issues which your automated stuff wouldn't have. A great example, still one of the worst projects I've had to work on was we found as we were migrating, the number of documents was fine. And I think the size was fine as well. Somehow, when we moved the documents across, we were finding two documents getting merged together. We were getting half from one and half from another halfway through. What? Now, I never would have tested for that. It still baffles me how it eventually turned out it was a non-Microsoft system. It turned out to be a debug mode. It was left on the on-premise one.
You only test for things you know about, and that's part of the challenge, isn't it?
Also, I was listening, I can't remember, it was a podcast. No, it's an audio book. I know we'll talk about books, and that was one of them. But it was talking about, I've suddenly gone blank, but the known knowns, the unknown knowns, the known unknown unknowns, and things like that. There are unknown unknowns that are things you don't know and you don't expect. I wouldn't expect to open every single document and scroll all the way to the end on there. That to me is a test too far. Thankfully, one person did, and that highlighted an issue. And at that point, then you can start to go back to your more automated ones and put in place something, find out ways to check that.
I think this is a really crucial concept, though, is we at the outset will never know all the tests that are going to be needed. And when we find something that hasn't worked, we should then work out how do we actually validate it to make sure it has worked.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely crucial, because every time we add a validation test, we're adding another level of confidence to what we're doing. And, I know, what we're working on at the moment, we probably have 17 steps that we're going through, and we're having to validate every step to go, are the numbers good? Yes, yes, yes. And we are incrementing the number of tests that we carry out so that our validation at the end goes, yes, we can prove that everything is accurate. So, and it's test driven design.
So how do you test a test? I mean, a great example is on this project where we're going up to SharePoint Online and looking to see the number of items, and throttling comes into play, which is always fun. So making sure that something, it's not that something isn't there, it's that your process of trying to check something there isn't working as well, is something you need to consider, whether that's through logging. That's a great example. Don't just say, is it there, is it not? Boom. Make sure you're capturing some detail from that, that you can check the output and see the number of errors from the test as well. I think that high level validation of numbers as well gives you an indication, so you can confirm whether your test is wrong or whether your process is wrong. But it is an important thing to think about.
Visibility. That's how you test your test. Am I seeing the steps going on? Yes. Okay. Log it. Make sure that I've got visibility that something is going on. The worst test you can run, if it's a long running test, is where you don't have any feedback to know, has it stopped? Should I kill it? Is it still going? Is it doing anything? It's just right.
How long is it going to take? Yeah.
So whether that's, it's right into a database and you can see rows being updated, whether that's a visual marker, your PowerShell, and you're just continuously writing something out that shows that something is taking place, you need to have confidence that your test is running. And in terms of testing your test, redundancy. Run it 3 times. Do you get the same numbers every time?
If your test fails a lot, then you're looking for another job. Yeah.
But it's genuinely, it is that easy though, isn't it? If you've got the time and you've got the the time to actually do that.
But I think that brings us on to the last topic of how do you capture your tests. I think most importantly, it's important you do exactly as you're saying there, Al. When you're running these tests, have them go to a database, have them do a way that you can go and query and be able to easily roll up those numbers, whether it's a nice Power BI chart that displays to people, here's the number of tests that passed, here's the number that failed, whether that's through a CI, CD, a continuous integration, continuous deployment environment like Azure DevOps that will give you good visualization on running those automated unit tests or integration tests. Make sure they're captured. If they're manual tests, don't get someone to just test it and they yeah, it's all good. Make sure they're capturing what tests they're doing. When they capture that something has gone wrong, make sure they're capturing what steps they took to get to that place, what they were doing, even what platform they're using, what time of day it is. Seen many times where things go wrong at specific times of day. If you've got that data there, you can go and start to look at those patterns.
Yeah, manual testing is something that if you're using an Excel spreadsheet, chances are it's not going to be good enough from what I've seen. Azure DevOps, I've used the manual testing in there. You can write your test cases in there. You can build out different environments like Kev said. So do you have different browsers? Do you have different Windows versions? You got people on Windows 7, or, 8 and 10, and it will build out all those different scenarios for you. So you like what we were saying at the beginning now about how much time should go into testing. I think in some cases it works in the browser. Okay, what's everyone else use? Oh yeah, they're on, and you start to then look at the organization, the different environments that it can run in, and the different browsers that it can run in, increases the level of efforts needed to really test it properly.
And I think we're talking about the development phase, the delivery phase. The much harder one to test is there is a defect that has been raised on something that is in production. How do you diagnose things? Testing for diagnosis is a completely different game where you actually need to be saying, what am I testing for? What are my hypotheses about the cause?
Can you repeat it?
Can you repeat it?
It happens sometimes.
Inevitably, it's sometimes, at which point all of those factors that you've mentioned, Gary, all come into play. Oh, well, it's on certain people's laptops. Yeah, when they're in that location on that Wi-Fi network, that's when it. Oh, right, okay. Yeah. At that point, it really is important to record every variable you can possibly think of, because every time you think of a new variable, all right, I've got another 17 tests to run now because I have to repeat everything that I've already run, but I've got a different variable to add in.
Yeah. And I've just a thought has just popped into my head of we're talking about, in the enterprise, we're kind of spoilt, right? Because generally there's a standard machine and it's obviously we've got bring your own devices, but generally in the main people are on similar devices, similar operating systems. We've all got mobile phones. We all have different versions and makes, and we all have apps that should work on all of these different platforms. Just think of how many tests they have to do for an app that runs on all these different operating systems, and different form factors as well, different size screens. It's massive. It's mind-blowing when you think of it, and yet people go to that detail because they
different
need the
data
confidence.
quality. What happens to this app when you start to lose a signal, when it's kind of half working.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think we'll start to wrap up, but one of my favorite sites, I don't know if it's still running, I'll try and have a look and put it in the show notes if it is, but it was called WTF, Worse Than Failure, and it was all stories about funny things. There was a great one about a developer who put in his unit tests, put in his code, it had a whole load of zeros and it would basically pause, and every time there was a bit of functionality that they felt was needed that wouldn't get signed off, they'd talk a performance one, they'd knock a few zeros off and then do all the things they thought they could do, which I thought was lovely. But the one that always I remember from that was from the 60s, and I think it was the US Army, and they had one sort of big old computers, lots of transistors and valves and all sorts of stuff like that over the place, and it was probably adding two numbers together just to show it, and they got the nice demo and the general came along, and just as he got near it, all cut out and stopped working. They were like, oh, so sorry, it's gone wrong, there must be a fuse blown somewhere, so they sort of fixed it. It came back a few days later, just as he came by, went wrong again. They were like, why is it still doing this? They moved the meeting to different times. They thought maybe it was something going on there. Eventually it worked out. The general had shoes and was on a nylon carpet, and the static of him working through was triggering off the computer and shutting it down. So there are things that you've got to be pretty happy when you work it out, but the environment, all sorts of random things can play into this, and the more tests you've got, the more details where you can pinpoint. I think they managed to find it by being exactly the point of where it was and exactly where the trigger worked. They could see that something they'd seen a site spike, and that gave an indication what's working. Put in place good tests, you can help fix things better.
Yeah, you could spend months looking for things. It's those unknown unknowns.
Yeah.
I remember a website that I used to work on, and a client, it kept dropping off. It kept logging people off, and we couldn't work out what it was. And it really tested, because all of our developers were going, well, everything's working on our end. I'm like, okay, yeah, but what about the client? And it turned out they had outbound IP round robining off different IPs, outbound IPs, so it wasn't sticky sessions. It took us 6 months to work that one out, and we went, right, there we go. Yeah, but I've got hundreds of those sorts of stories of stuff. Yeah, it takes months to work out just because you have no idea that it's even possible in the first place.
And look at that, we've managed to get through pretty much a whole show without saying just occasionally there's peppercack problem between the chair and keyboard, or keyboard and chair.
Oh, that'll never go away. You can't write tests for that.
So you will always get someone who's telling you, yes, I'm clicking on the button on the left, whereas actually they're clicking on the button on the right and things like that. Again, make sure you have the logging and testing in there. You can prove those things haven't happened. So I think as a summary, do get testy. Do make sure you've got your test in place. Do think about whatever you're releasing, how you're going to test it, how you're going to prove you've tested it, how you've covered all those different things, and how you can continue testing it so that you can change quickly, evolve quickly as well. But yeah, trust us, it helps. We'll be back next week, I think, with the news, and then the week after that we'll have another guest. I think we've got lined up. We're getting close to Easter, so we'll announce in the show notes who the
Easter
guests.
Bunny.
Easter Bunny, yeah, that's a good one.
I've got to double check. I know we're going to hopefully have Laura GB soon, so maybe we can get Laura along as the Easter Bunny. I think that would be pretty good. I think she'd work there. Hi, Laura, if you're listening. Otherwise, thank you very much. Have a lovely week, and we will speak to you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Grey Hat Beard Podcast. The song Drink Up My Mateys was brought to you by Black Bones under a non-commercial attribution license.